Which era of rock music is the best? That is the time-old question that everybody's been asking. Who had the best music? I mean, this question is spanned between generations, and it's only going to get tougher as we have more generations of rock musicians coming in. But objectively, who is the best? Now, I haven't compiled a list of every single one of these decades. Also, for the sake of argument, I'm going to leave out the 2020s because they've been here for like, 2 or 3 years or something. And, obviously because they've got MGK, they would take the tail. But, it's being objectively fair. I can't put him into the running yet. So coming in at the bottom, we have the 2010s. Just a completely ass generation of music. Not that many rock stars come out, not that many bands worth talking about really. Just a pretty pathetic excuse for a generation of music. I think maybe indie rock was popular at the start, but I don't know, at that point, rock music had died so much that we literally couldn't tell it apart from a vegetable in the hospital. It's that dire. And you might disagree. You might say like, oh, I love metalcore. I love fucking deathcore. I love all the stuff that came out. That's just great. But to be fair, it has lost relevance to shit like this. That's pretty pathetic when you think about it. And then you might argue the underground was good, but the underground always is good. It's always got people going and trying out different things, trying out new sounds. So you can't really compare. What you can really compare about it is how good is the overall. And can't really say there was much going on. So absolutely 7th place for the 2010s. Next, we got the 50s. I would say that the 50s, pretty bland compared to everything else. Not to disrespect on the 50s, absolutely an important time for rock because it was the time where it came out from like being, an idea that some guy had like, while he was playing guitar to, a full-on movement. Albeit it was a very small one, but it got the ball rolling, right? And that's all that matters. Yes, it kind of sucks, didn't have distortion, didn't even have bass guitars apparently, but they made it work. Unlike the 2010s, we did actually have a star in the 50s. That would be Elvis Presley. Maybe nobody else really matters, but he definitely does, and he trumps an entire generation of talentless hacks in the 2010s. So 50s come 6th, literally because the 2010s had nothing better else to offer. Right, so next, we got the 60s. Probably a bit of a controversial one because the 60s were a big time in music, We had the Beatles, we had the Rolling Stones, we had the Animals, we had so many great bands and artists come out from there. And it really shaped rock into what we kind of think of it today. I mean, we legit went from guys in suits, the very nice boys, playing guitars in front of a live audience, to some really dirty, grimy rock stars who just didn't give a fuck about anyone. They were dangerous. These are the boys that you're gonna look at. They're not nice boys. No, these guys are dropping LSD on the regs. And speaking of LSD, it brought us some great shit. Look at the second half of the Beatles. Look at Jimi Hendrix. Like, so many fucking great things from that. However, there were some downsides. Brought us hippies. Hippies are definitely a downside. I mean, they did good for Vietnam, let's put it that way, but other than that, kind of a letdown about hippies. None of this interesting stuff really happened until about, halfway through the decade, so you can't give it as much credit as maybe we think, They still wasted like, a good 4 or 5 years. So I think it stands, the 60s, I'm gonna be in there. Right, next up, we got the 2000s. Pretty memorable, a very hot sort of era for nostalgia at the moment. Literally everyone's fucking ripping them off, but, only worse. But to be fair, it did have some good stuff in it, like especially in the early 2000s. You had pop punk, nu metal, you had fucking emo in the mid 2000s. Like a lot of stuff was happening in it, and it was great that we were seeing like, rock stars, still doing their thing after, how many years. The problem though, is that this was the time where rock really went on the decline. I mean, it went from like being, pretty solid in the charts to, not being able to remember a single song that came out or worth of note. I mean, it was just really diabolical by the end of the decade, and it really shows because, the 2010s existed. So, I wouldn't say it was exactly a great time. Then you could also argue that like the early 2000s were pretty much just a hangover of the 90s, which were really sick. And you might be wondering, why would you put this over the 60s? Because this is a very unbiased review, and it has absolutely nothing to do with my personal tastes that I put over here. A good decade, but probably overrated. So we have the 80s. Pretty good all around, probably one of the most romantic sort of eras of metal and rock. Plenty of big personalities out there. Ozzy Osbourne started his solo career, fucking did great with that. Had all the hair metal bands, you had all the thrash metal bands, you had so much shit in the underground that we just take for granted, like black metal, death metal, hardcore, pop punk, normal punk, fucking so much shit. Goth as well, fuck, can't remember that. Only problems is a lot of misogyny, very bad thing. Also a boomer decade, very much a bad thing. Also very homophobic, again, I'm gonna have to put that as a bad thing for it. It's not really that great, but at the same time, you've got to show respect. It's 80s had some decent stuff. And that would be shown by Stranger Things pretty much, because that show is just nostalgia bait for the 80s. So next, we have the 70s coming in at number 2. I would say it's pretty damn good. It's probably the go-to when everybody says it's the best rock genre of music. I would disagree. I would say the 90s were better, but we'll get to them later. In terms of positives though, we had heavy metal got introduced by Black Sabbath, fucking great. Hard rock was a big thing, Led Zeppelin, AC/DC, a lot of those sort of bands, fantastic. And then you also got punk at the end of it, which is also pretty sick. And then you gotta think of how many bands. You got Kiss, you got Black Sabbath, Led Zeppelin, AC/DC, the Sex Pistols, Ramones. There's just so many different bands. Fuck it. Pink Floyd, David Bowie, Queen. But it did come with some drawbacks. That being, we've got yacht rock, pretty fucking boring. Also, high boomer energy, and that is a pretty big downside in itself. More than the 80s, to be honest, because at least in the 80s they had the excuse of being on coke all the time. 70s, not really. So again, objectively, I'd say the 70s were in second tier. Alright, and finally, we have the 90s. Objectively, the best era of rock music. Done through all of my research and, you know, my very objective looks into each of these decades. I'd say it's the 90s because heaps of weird shit got popular. I mean, look at the grunge boys. How many people are really gonna be on that same level as Kurt with, you know, In Utero and all that stuff? Kind of fucking weird. Still had some of the biggest rock stars of all time. You know, Nirvana, Soundgarden, Alice in Chains, Pearl Jam. Huge bands of the 90s. And you had Green Day, you had The Offspring. Yes, they were pretty big back in the 90s. And you had so much talent going out there. So many crazy ideas coming out. I'd say it definitely deserves to be up here in number 1's position. I think of all the experimental sort of stuff that came out, like, you know, Rage Against the Machine. Like, who'd have thought they would have been a good idea for a band? And even Primus and Ska, like, fuck, who'd have thought they would be popular? I mean, I definitely take those two as a negative because they're just fucking too weird. Also, a lot of the shit in the early 2000s were pretty much because of the 90s, you know, I think pop punk, new metal, basically just the 90s rolling over a few more years. But overall, I'd say the 90s fucking fantastic. I cannot. Most of the shit that you'll probably listen to came from the 90s. Oh, and also not a boomer decade. That is a definite benefit for the 90s over the other two. At least it's not yet, so I'll have to take it there. Right, so objectively, I've got my list up here. Say what you agree and what you don't agree with. 90s definitely the best genre. Absolutely no bias there at all. So now when you're going up and trying to argue with people about what era of music's the best, for rock at least, you have this list to go off of. You have, you know, scientifically amalgamated knowledge all in one place. Thank you very much for watching. I'll see you in the next video.